Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. As Michael said, I'm Allison. I'm the director of the museum, and I want to welcome those of you who have never attended our History Happy Hours before. This is a monthly program that we've been holding for about 6 years. And of course, last March, we decided to former executive producer of NPR's Morning Edition, and she's been very kind to make some wonderful introductions for us. So I know Ellen's in the audience, Pam. So my job tonight is to introduce our moderators. Those of you, again, who have joined us more recently might not know that we select people from the community to be moderators in order to just expand our circle and to make people feel even more a part of the museum. So tonight's moderators are actually two sisters, Dr. Ann Savarese and Miss Carolyn Savarese. Dr. Savarese is the former Division Chief of Pediatric Anesthesiology at the University of Maryland Medical Center and an assistant professor of anesthesiology and pediatrics at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Her clinical expertise is the anesthetic management of neonates, infants, and children undergoing complex repairs of congenital heart disease. She's been recognized multiple times as Teacher of the Year in her department and as a top doctor in Baltimore Magazine. And Ann's sister, Carolyn, is a literary agent with Kinnear and Williams. She was previously with the Perseus Book Group. She's worked on behalf of authors such as Elizabeth Warren, Samantha Power, George Soros, Henry Louis Gates, Christopher Hitchens, and many, many more. We're really excited to have moderators with such relevant experience to engage with our guest speaker. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Ann.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you again for inviting us to moderate. I did sort of rook my sister into helping me with this because I didn't feel that I was competent to do it. And so since she's a literary person, I invited her, and I appreciate her being here as well. And you will too. I have the privilege of introducing our guest, who's our speaker and author this evening, Pam Fessler, who many of you will recognize. I know that many of the folks who attend our Sandy Spring Happy Hours are people who listen to NPR, and you will recognize Pam Fessler as one of the most eminent correspondents for NPR. She has a degree from Douglas College in New Jersey, also a master's degree from Syracuse University. Her beginnings of her career, she actually worked for the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. She worked for Congressional Quarterly Magazine, and eventually she became a correspondent and reporter for NPR. She worked on their Washington desk. She worked as their election editor, covered a great deal of elections in the 80s and 90s. She was their first Homeland Security correspondent, which was a position that developed after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And she's covered a great deal about elections and voting. More recently, she's been focusing her stories on homelessness, hunger, affordable housing, income equality, and she has won a prize for her poverty reporting. In 2011, she received the First Place National Headliner Award for her poverty reporting. This evening, we have her here to discuss her book, Carville's Cure, which I'll show you here. As my sister makes sure that I make sure you see the book.
Yep.
And hopefully some of you will buy the book when you're finished with this evening's presentation, which is a fascinating story about leprosy and the history of leprosy and how it was treated, managed, and the people who experienced it and lived it in the United States, which really has been an untold story. As a physician, I knew none of this story of leprosy in the United States. I obviously had to learn about leprosy as an illness in medical school, but I didn't learn anything about the experience of American citizens and immigrants to the United States who suffered from leprosy, how they were treated. And it's a fascinating story. So let's introduce Pam and let her start maybe just with telling us, Pam, how you came to write this book.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And, a lot of people, if you look at my record, I've covered many, many, many things. And one thing I've never covered is disease or health. So you may wonder how, in fact, I ended up writing a book about leprosy of all things. And like a lot of good stories, it started out as a family secret. And about 20 years ago, my father-in-law, who was 78 years old at the time, just called us out of the clear blue. And he said, I have something I need to tell you. I've been keeping something a secret for more than 60 years. He said, when I was a young boy, when I was a teenager, I went to school one day and I came home and the public health service had come during the day and taken my father away. And I never saw or spoke to my father again.
Mm.
And he knew that his father had leprosy, um, but he didn't know where he had been taken. And his mother told him and his siblings at that time, do not tell anybody that your father had leprosy, because the stigma of this disease is so great that she said it would destroy the family. So this was back in the 1930s. So he never told anybody. He kept it a secret for more than 60 years. But as an older man, he just decided he had to, had been such a burden that he had to tell us. So we, of course, were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Whatever happened to him? And that's when I started doing research and trying to figure out what had happened to his father. And we discovered, unbeknownst to any of us and many Americans, that the US federal government ran a hospital in Carville, Louisiana, a leprosy hospital. And for decades in this country, through most of the 20th century, people in this country who were diagnosed with leprosy were taken from their homes and they were brought to Carville and they were confined there. And many of them were confined there for decades until they died. And we were just astonished. So we actually went with my father-in-law down to visit Carville, which still existed then. This was in 1998. And there were still patients there who they were no longer forced to be there, but they lived there because they had nowhere else to go. And when I got there, I realized that this was not just our family's story, that there were hundreds and thousands of families that had been torn apart and really stigmatized by this disease. And then it turns out, I learned that leprosy is actually one of the least contagious diseases there is. It is very hard to contract. 95% of the human race can't even get the disease. And then the other 5%, it's very, very difficult to get. So these people were confined and they lost not only their freedom, they lost their identities because many of them were told to take aliases to save their families from shame. They even lost the right to vote. And it was all because of, one, ignorance about the disease, and two, the stigma. And I want to just I'm going to show a couple of photos here, and I hope I'm able to share. Hey, okay. There we go. So this is a picture of my father-in-law's father. And he was a young soldier in the Spanish-American War. This was taken in 1902. And he served in the Philippines. And we're pretty sure that that's where he picked up the disease, that it's a bacterial disease. But the amazing thing about leprosy, it is very slow developing. So this is 1902. He did not even have symptoms until 1922. And that's when he started feeling this tingling in his hand. He actually was not taken to Carville until 1935. So that is what a very, very slow developing disease. But, people didn't know that at the time. So at the turn of the century, there was a lot of fear about germs and what, that we have this image of leprosy from the Bible that is just this awful disease. There were people have the impression that fingers fall off, all of these things that are not true. And so there was a big movement at the time to do something about people with leprosy. And Carville was created at the turn of the century by the state of Louisiana, which actually had a lot of leprosy cases. And there was a lot of hysteria in the newspapers, and people said, we've got to do something about these people. We can't have them just walking around. And so the state decided, okay, we'll create a leprosy hospital where they can be cared for, but then we'll also be isolated from the rest of the public. So they wanted to build it in about 70 miles from New Orleans, closer to Baton Rouge, right on the Mississippi River. It was the only place the state could find to build this facility. It couldn't even, and they didn't even want to tell the neighbors that they were going to build a leprosy hospital there because they were afraid of what happened. They said that they were going to have an ostrich farm. That's what they told them when they built it. They actually snuck the patients up in the middle of the night on a barge so nobody would know that they were actually coming. They had to put the patients back in the old slave quarters in the back because this mansion, as you can see, is totally wrecked. And you know what they did then? They basically abandoned the patients and left them there. And that was the beginning of Carville. And eventually, they wanted to take care of the patients. They couldn't get anybody to go take care of them. They hired the Daughters of Charity sisters, who were the only people who would come and actually take care of the patients. And they stayed there and they struggled for years. And at the same time, there was a lot of demand around the rest of the country. There were a number of very high profile leprosy cases. And people said, we need to do something. We need to create a national leprosarium. And this debate went on for years, actually. They finally decided, Congress decided to create a national leprosarium. Again, they couldn't find any place, anybody who was willing to let them build the leprosarium there. The federal government took over the Carville facility, which by then was starting to become a relatively decent looking place. And it became the National Leprosarium, and that was in 1921. And they started bringing patients. That's when people who were diagnosed with this disease were brought to Carville from all around the country. And it's a big 350-acre plantation. But it was fenced in so that the patients could not leave, and they were not allowed to leave. And over time, it became like this extraordinary facility because it was not only a prison for these patients, it also became kind of a haven for a lot of them because the world outside was not very nice to people who were diagnosed with leprosy. So it had this sort of weird of sense of both people being imprisoned, but inside it was almost an oasis for these patients. And they created this incredible world inside of Carville where they had sporting teams, they had plays, some people fell in love. They weren't allowed to get married, but that didn't stop people. People actually had children, although the babies were taken away. It became an extraordinary place. And then we can talk more about this story because I know that both Carolyn and Anne have read the book, but the patients eventually started to rally. And they realized that leprosy was not that contagious. And they realized that they were unfairly being confined against their wills by their own country. And they began to band together, and they started one of what I think is probably one of the first patient advocacy movements in this country. And we can talk more about this, what they did, but it was pretty extraordinary. So I'm happy to have you guys ask me questions first, or I can continue to talk about the story.
Well, one of the things that I was fascinated by was this 105-year history of Carville, that they had over 5,000 patients there over the course of that time, which is just, when you think about how many, each individual patient, some families were confined there, sometimes like your father-in-law's father, just a single person was, but sometimes entire families were sent there, and they basically were just plucked out of their communities. Talk to me a little bit about inherent in the stigma. These people changed their names to protect their families back in their own communities. I mean, it was just shocking to me.
Right. So my husband's last name that was Cole is Cole, Koll. And when he when his grandfather went to Carville, he was told he should take an alias, and he became Morris Krug, K-U-R-G. And, all the patients did this up until about the 50s or 60s. In the 1950s and 60s, things started changing. But up until then, so it was very dehumanizing in so many ways, just that you could not even keep your name. And there are tombstones. A lot of the patients ended up being buried at Carville. There's a cemetery in the back, and on the tombstones, their patient number, and often it's the alias that is on the tombstone, not even their real name.
Real name
is on the thing. And I think it was just part of this whole. We say, they were taken there because of the stigma, not because it was actually a public health threat. And so this was more of that you are not even worth having your name. And I think that had a profound effect on the patients. The other thing you mentioned, which I think is kind of interesting, that there were families there where there were numerous members of the same family. And that was fairly common. And it's partly because, as I said, 95% of the human race can't even get leprosy. But the other 5% probably have this genetic predisposition. And so that's why you tended to find people who, often it was siblings. And it was not only because they had the same genetic predisposition to actually being able to contract the disease, but they also spent a lot of time together. So if one child got it and they were living, sharing a bedroom, another one might get it, but it could be 10 years later. Which was also, part of the reason that they confined these patients is they thought that it would stop the disease from spreading. But of course, that was ridiculous because it didn't show up for years and years and years after somebody actually contracted the disease and was, contagious. I did part of one of my stories is there's one family. I can actually show you the photo here, the Landry family. Let me just get that one up here. Okay, so this family will go. So this is the Landrys. So you see the mother and the father, and they are 5 children. All 5 of them ended up living in Carville. They all died in Carville. They all went at different times. This young man here was the first one, and he, this was in the early, before the federal government actually took over, so early 20s. And shortly after he died, his older brother contracted the disease, realized that he too had the disease. And he knew what was going to happen to him when he went to Carville. And he, again, was taken away from the family. And these were people, by that time he had 2 little children. People were taken away from their families. There were mothers, there were fathers who had to leave their children behind. There were children who were taken away from their parents and brought to Carville. The interesting thing to me is of these 5, none of them actually died of leprosy. People didn't really die of leprosy. They died of other diseases. I think the youngest one, the first one there, died of malaria. One of the other ones died of kidney disease. A lot of people died just of old age. And they lived, it was over a 60-year period that a member of the Landry family was at Carville.
Was that, Pam, wasn't there a leper colony that was established in the Hawaiian Islands?
Yeah, there had been one. Yes, there was one it was established in the 1860s.
Yeah, so I wonder if it predated any of this happening.
Yeah, so that had been developed by what was the Hawaiian government. It was not the U.S. federal government, and it was. I wouldn't say it was shut down by the time Carville was opened, but it was. They were not forcing patients, Hawaiians, to go to Carville, but it was very similar. And in fact, when they created Carville, they looked at the leprosy colony in Hawaii as a model. This idea of isolating the patients, but letting them. I mean, honestly, they created a whole world in there. It was a whole social,
Mhm.
they had schools, as I said, they had sporting activities. Um, it was it's kind of a world unto itself because they knew this wasn't just a hospital, this was their home. This is where these
Mhm.
people lived. And the difference between the one in Hawaii and the one in Carville, well, the two difference. One is the one in Carville was run by the U.S. federal government, the U.S. Public Health Service. The other thing is that they, um, over the years, started doing a lot of research there. They had laboratory, they had a pharmacy. They did a lot of the basic research on trying to find a cure for this disease,
Mhm.
which there was no cure. Not only was there no cure, there really was no effective treatment at all. And it was in the 1940s at Carville that they discovered what is became the cure for leprosy. Um, right now, today, it's actually
It's
easily
still,
cured. It's easily cured with this sort of three drug cocktail, an
Mhm.
antibiotic, but it was found at Carville. So that was a big difference there. And these patients, they were very much involved in trying to help find the cure because they knew they were stuck there, and they volunteered for a lot of the research. They actually pushed the doctors every time, every time there was um, something that somebody somewhere in the world said, we think this might work. This particular plant might work to help cure this disease. The patient said to the doctors, "Let's try this. Let's try this." And half the time, the doctor's like, "No, no, no. I don't think we should do that. That's silly." But the patients, sometimes they would actually sneak in medication just to try it because they were so desperate to get out.
Pam, I'm seeing some questions come through in the chat room, and you have about almost 50 people listening. So we're going to get to some of their questions. But first, as a book publisher and a literary agent, I just wanted to say your book is everything that I love about narrative nonfiction, which I represent professionally, because the stories are about real people living real lives that are actually far more fascinating than fiction. But if I may, I'm going to ask you this question. Who were some of the most memorable figures in the research that you did for this book? You mentioned the Sisters of Charity, but were there heroes and leaders and any villains? I mean, there was this whole social system going on there. Were they all saints? Were there any sinners? Were there characters that really stuck out for you? Tell us about them.
I would say there are two patients that really stick out to me. One was a guy named John Early, who was also a veteran who had also been in the Philippines, and that's probably where he picked up this disease. In 1908, this before Carville even got started, he went to Washington, D.C. to get a pension. And while he was there, there was a rash on his face, and he called a doctor. They called a doctor into his boarding house where he was staying. And the doctor had no idea what was wrong. And Early said to him, "Oh, what do I got, Dr. Leprosy? Ha 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 ha." Well, the doctor's like, "Oh my goodness, maybe he does have leprosy." And so he called in a health official. Health official didn't know what it was. And they thought, "Oh, maybe he's got leprosy." They locked him in his room. They went and they got somebody to get a skin sample. Um, but meanwhile, they got so nervous, they took John Early from his boarding room, which was right near the US Capitol. They packed him up, all of his belongings, and they carted him to, I am going to, another picture. Just one second. Um, they took him to, I love this photo. All you people from Washington, D.C. This is along the banks of the Potomac River in Southeast DC, where now is close to where the DC jail is. They stuck him in a quarantine tent there. because they didn't know what to do with him. And the next day in the newspaper, there was a big headline that said, "Leper found in DC, Washington, DC, a nation's capital." And people came from all over to see him. He was guarded. They couldn't get close, but they came because he was such an oddity. And he was there. He was kept there for 6 months because health officials had no idea what to do with him. There was no leprosy hospital, National Leprosy Hospital at the time. Eventually, it got cold, so they let him move into a house nearby with his wife and 2 children, but they built a brick wall down the middle of the house with his wife and 2 children on one side, and he was on the other side, and they were never allowed to have any kind of contact. That's how freaked out people were about this disease. Anyway, this goes on and on and on for actually years that he is quarantined. He eventually escapes. He's quarantined in Washington state. He escapes. He decides that the federal government needs to do something about people like him because we can't. They're just shunted all around the country. He escapes from a quarantine station in Washington state. He boards a train anonymously. He comes across the country. He decides to mingle with everybody he can. He goes to New York City. He goes to Broadway shows. He goes to a baseball game, a Yankees doubleheader. He gets on another train. He goes to Washington, D.C. He checks into the finest hotel in Washington, D.C., where the vice president of the United States actually lives and diplomats. He hangs out with them for a couple of days. Then he calls in the newspaper men and he says, "I just want to tell you that there is a leper," and I don't use that word now, but he did at the time. There is a leper who has been living in the midst of all these rich and famous people. And you need to do something about this. The government has to decide what to do to care for people like me. People were so outraged, headlines all across the country. Members of Congress went to the floor of the House, and that day they introduced legislation to create a national leprosarium, and that is how Carville was created. So he's one of my favorite patients. My other favorite one, and ultimately ended up at Carville, and he was a rabble rouser. I mean, he was just constantly trying to break the rules and fight for the patients. The other one was a guy named Stanley Stein, who was just this amazing patient. He was he was brought to Carville as a young man. He was in his late 20s. It was in 1929. He was very educated, very ambitious. And when he got to Carville and he saw all these people walking around kind of hopeless, because they didn't know what was going to happen to them, he said he was not going to become one of the living dead. And he is the one who started a lot of the plays, the theater. He wanted to give them hope and life. And the big thing he did is he asked the health officials if he could start a patient newspaper. And they're like, "Okay, sure, sure." So he starts this newspaper. At first, it's just kind of a little in-house rag, it's got like with the menu for the, Sunday night's dinner, who's, got a letter from who so-and-so, stupid little puzzles, that type of thing. But eventually the articles start to become edgier and the patients start writing these articles. Why are we here? Why are we being imprisoned? This is not a contagious disease. Why is the government doing this? And they started really questioning the public health service. And the paper started getting circulated not only at Carville among the patients, but it started getting circulated around the country because the American Legion adopted the patient. There were so many veterans there. They adopted their cause and they started spreading this message. This newspaper had tens of thousands of subscribers. And it was Stanley Stein and the patients who started to fight to regain their rights and to regain the respect of the public and ultimately won the patient's freedom. And you have to read the book to get all the details.
There you go.
Stanley was really an extraordinary person and an extraordinary American. And he lived there. He died there when he was 68 years old.
Wow.
Oh, actually, I should tell you. So besides enlisting, not only getting the help of the American Legion, Stanley was really smart. And he had some good friends who had contacts with people on Broadway. And one day he was at Carville and somebody said, "Oh, there's a phone call for you out front." And so he went out front and he picked up the phone, and on the other end of the phone was a voice that said, "It's Tallulah, darling." It was Tallulah Bankhead, who they had a mutual friend, and Stanley was a big Broadway theater. He loved the theater. He practically keeled over. Well, they developed an extraordinary friendship, and she decided to help the patients. And she got all of her friends on Broadway to subscribe to the newspaper and to start touting this issue of these people, that the federal government was unfairly confining these people and taking away their rights. And I have this, can I show another picture? This is
Yes, and then we're going to take some questions from the
Yes.
audience.
Okay.
I love this picture.
I know everybody loves this one. I'm gonna skip through a few other ones. We can get to those. We can get to those. Oh, by the way, I'll go. That's the star, one of the covers of it. And this, one reason I want to show this is because this after World War II, the patients really started to fight for their freedom because they were very involved in the war effort, just like all Americans were. You know, they raised money, they had victory gardens, but here they were still confined behind barbed wire by their own government. And so this was one of these issues. And you can see there's a patient there who's looking out at the barbed wire fence. The American flag says July 4th, Independence Day, buy bonds for freedom. And it says, with liberty and justice for all, but not them. And let me just go to the next picture. This is Stanley. At one point, the patients were, after they found the drug that started to cure the disease and people started getting better, patients were allowed to go on leave. And so Stanley was starting to get better, and Tallulah Bankhead invited him up to New York for a whirlwind tour. And she took him all these Broadway shows. And this is a picture of him at a party in her apartment after one of her shows. And this was in the local newspaper. But this was incredible PR for the patients and for the cause. She was not scared of being with somebody with leprosy at all. And this is what Stanley wanted, to get that message out. We should not be feared.
Right. That's an incredibly powerful image. It reminds me of the one of Lady Di holding children in
HIV baby.
HIV babies. You know, a picture goes a long way when it's done right. Okay, I'm going to take some questions from the audience here. First off, Sylvie Henderson, who's been waiting very patiently, she says, was the facility segregated by gender and race?
That's a great question. It was definitely segregated by gender. It was, in fact, because the Daughters of Charity were basically running it for so many years. They did not want the men and women to mingle at all. It took a really long time for the patients to be able to even be allowed to have like a Sunday afternoon where they could hang out together. When the federal government took over, there was a little bit more intermingling, but men were not allowed in, in women's rooms or in the women's dorms and vice versa. There were some patients who got married. Initially, when they were married, if they were married, they were also separated. They had to be in separate dorms, although over the years, the patients actually were able to build these little sheds and which became little houses out in the back, and the married couples lived there. And this was sort of one of the odd things about Carville. It They were confined, but some of the doctors there, some of the public health service officials realized that they had to give them some freedom because that this was where these patients were stuck in. They gave them freedom within the place. So the federal government actually let them build these little sheds and houses in the back, and it was something called Cottage Grove. And the patients actually sold them from one to another. So you had the segregation by the genders. Racially, the living quarters, there were separate quarters for Blacks and whites, but they dined together. There was they had a school there. The students were it was an integrated classroom. They had sporting teams. They were integrated. Carville had an incredible cross section of Americans. There were rich people, there were poor people, there were whites, Blacks, there were Asian Americans, there were Hispanic Americans. There were highly educated people. There were people who were who were illiterate, but they all mingled together. They all actually worked together there. They went to school together. They socialized together. So, in a very bizarre way, Carville was probably one of the most diverse communities in our country at that time. We're talking the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s in southern Louisiana. And you had integrated classrooms. They had a sports team. They had integrated baseball teams. They were bound together by their shared illness. Yeah. They were discriminated against from the outside world because they were, had leprosy. So the other differences didn't, that the things that on the outside world would have kept them segregated did not inside. And I do want to show you actually another one of my favorite photos. And this was taken in, let's see where this is. So this was taken, we think this was taken like in the 40s sometime. And there was they had a clubhouse, they had a movie place. So this was a little bar that they had. Well, look at this. Look at all these patients. You've got, Black patients, white patients, Hispanic patients, Asian patients, all these guys together in a bar. There's no other bar in southern Louisiana in the 1940s that you would have seen that. And I think that in some ways it was this diversity of the patients that actually made them very strong as an advocacy group when they did actually start advocating for themselves.
They certainly were all being discriminated against for their leprosy, but through that they found common ground, and therefore, their humanity came forward to support each other. Going to take another question here. This is from David Hickson, who says, so how has your study of Carville and leprosy informed your perspective on the current COVID pandemic?
A couple of ways. I think one of the biggest ways is just this recognition that sort of knowing the facts and making public health decisions based on facts and not just feelings or prejudice about what we think is the right thing to do, is so important. Because what happened with Carville, you know, what our public health service did, and we as a country did, was all based, as I say, on ignorance, but also prejudice. There, in fact, were doctors at the time who said, I don't think that this is that serious an illness or that contagious an illness, but people just had this image, mostly from the Bible, about leprosy and how dangerous it was, and so people reacted just based on this, this ignorance. And I think, that there's a lot of people who, we like to look down upon people as others. And there's, no more than leprosy. This is sort of the quintessential other. And we kind of used disease to demonize people. And I see that we do that today to some extent. I mean, we certainly heard a lot about the, China virus. We have, Asian Americans in this country who are being assaulted by people who somehow think that they're responsible for this disease. And it makes people not do smart things when it comes to dealing with illness. So that was the big thing. And the other thing when I started writing this book, I cover poverty for NPR. And I've noticed, people who are, upset about homeless encampments, people who are upset about immigrants coming to the southern border. A lot of these opponents have said they're bringing diseases like leprosy into the United States. So, they're horrible. We need to do something about these people. And it's just using disease again to demonize people.
I'm going to, a question from Frank Kalawaski. Sorry, Frank, if I didn't pronounce that right. How difficult was gathering details about your family member? And is Carville a museum? Do they still maintain records? Again, Frank was asking, was the facility racially segregated? And as you said, even in the height of Jim Crow, it was not, which is astonishing. But this is a personal story, but obviously there were these moments when you realize this is so much bigger. This is a big social justice story. So start with the gathering of the details about your family, but then it obviously, reverberated, it echoed and got bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and actually, quite frankly, I probably have the least amount of information about our family, about my, we really had very few records at all about him, very, very, just like a one-page medical report that we were able to get some information from. But there was a gold mine of information down at Carville about a lot of the other patients. Not only did some of the patients, like Stanley Stein, another one, Betty Martin, write memoirs about their lives there, which were wonderfully descriptive depictions of what they were going through. In fact, Betty Martin's book became a bestseller in the early 1950s. And Betty Martin actually being her alias. She couldn't actually use her she didn't want to use her real name when she wrote the book. And then like John Early, this was one of my greatest discoveries. I found out that he had a great granddaughter, and I called her up, and said, do you have anything from him? Can you tell me about him? Blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, I don't really have that much. And she didn't really know that much about him until she started reading it. She said, although I do have this memoir that he wrote, a copy of it was like 120-page thing that he had typed out, and she had the only copy. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. And I said, well, can I get a copy of it? And she's like, well, I don't really have it. She goes, but I do have it online. Do you want me to send it to you? And so she just zapped it to me. And John Early wrote so much about his anguish at having this disease and find. So a lot of what's in the book is from, John Early. The other thing is that the Daughters of Charity, who quite remained nurses there until 2000, until the place was shut down in 2000. They were meticulous record keepers. They kept diaries, daily diaries of everything that happened at Carville, and their records are all up at their. They have it's not their mother house, but one of their places up in Emmitsburg, Maryland, right up the street here from me. I was able to go there and go through all their archives. The sisters, one of the sisters, Sister Hillary Ross, was a photographer. She took tons of photos, not only of the patients, but of life there at Carville. So I had wonderful, wonderful records. And then there was the newspaper, The Star. It came out every month. It's still coming out, actually, believe it or not. And it again depicted, day-to-day life. And I really had a gold mine of information. And there is now a museum at Carville. The facility is, the US government turned it back over to the state of Louisiana in, I think, the year 2000. The Louisiana National Guard now uses it. They do training there and classroom instruction at the facility. It's actually this big, beautiful piece of property with these gorgeous, what were the dorms with long corridors, open air corridors, almost like a monastery. It's just beautiful. But one of the buildings has been turned into a museum. And the curator there is just wonderful. And she has all these artifacts of what daily life was like there, letters, did oral histories with a lot of the patients before they died. So I was really, really, really lucky as an author. I almost had too much material. I know authors never say that, but it was wonderful.
There is a grave site there, correct? And
Yeah.
and did families allow their family members to stay interned there, or were
Yeah, there was so it was a combination of things. There were people who their families had abandoned them, so they really had nowhere else. So they were buried at Carville. Some, when they did die, their family would come take the body and bring them back home. I think the Landrys ended up going back to their home to be buried. Then ultimately, what happened around the 1960s is the federal government, the medication was getting better, so patients were getting better. And the federal government was trying to say, I don't know if we don't know if we actually really need to still have this facility. They were no longer forcefully bringing people there. People still could come there and they'd be cared for. But the federal government started talking about the possibility of shutting it down, starting around I would say the 70s. Well, the patients, some of them had been there almost their entire lives. And they're like, you can't make us leave here. So it was this weird thing. All of a sudden things flipped.
Wow.
And some of them didn't want to leave because they had nowhere to go. Some of them had come as children and they were now older adults and they had never had jobs. And they told the federal government, you made us come here. You now have to take care of us. And ultimately, that's what happened. So some people ended up living the rest of their lives there. Some patients who had left actually came back as older people to be cared for and live there because they really had nothing else. And so some of those patients were buried, are buried in the back because this was their home.
Oh,
This is where, you know, this is where their loved ones were. This was their family. My father-in-law's father was in fact buried in a Jewish cemetery in Baton Rouge. And we're not quite sure why he wasn't buried at Carville, but it was the American Legion, because he was a veteran. They arranged to have him buried in Baton Rouge. And when we went down there with my father-in-law for the very first time, we had no idea where he was buried, but the public health service nurse had found it, and we went to his burial site, and I cannot tell you what it was like to be with my father-in-law, a 78-year-old man, to finally see where his father was buried. It was pretty extraordinary.
Mm, mm. The legacy of Carville. It's interesting. If other people have questions, chime in. We've got about 6 more minutes here. I think what's extraordinary about Carville is that it's starkly different than what happened in so many other states with regard to people with disabilities, other kinds of disease, and which became horror houses. And it's still, I think that's why people should buy your book, is to understand why this particular place and this community in this time of great isolation, deprivation, in so many ways flourished. And yet simultaneously, people who had cerebral palsy or other kinds of challenges didn't necessarily find that same kind of community. And this book is really a testament to so many things.
And I think the reason for that is a lot of these patients were in fairly good shape. I mean, even though they were diagnosed with leprosy, only a small portion were really, really, really infirm. And as I say, you had some highly educated people. So some of them had a lot of time on their hands. They were confined. And so that's why they were able to advocate for themselves. And the nuns, the sisters, they became real advocates for these patients because they realized that they were also that these patients were unfairly treated. And they encouraged them, to try and get the message out to the public that what their story was, to tell their story, not only for themselves, but for leprosy patients all around the world who, quite frankly, are still discriminated against today.
Right.
So the sisters helped, and actually the doctors from the public health
service
who were at Carville were also advocates and defenders of these patients. So I think it was all those things together that made this a very unique institution and just extraordinary in so many ways. What went on there. One of my favorite quotes is from Sister Cass Sullivan, she was a real rabble rouser and advocate. She would have been out there protesting the Vietnam War and everything if she had been alive later. But I use this as at the beginning of my book, and she says, "Mercy is no substitute for justice." And that was her motto, that just because people are being cared for here, that's no substitute for them having freedom and hope and being able to go out and live their lives and not being torn from their families.
I do think that the Daughters of Charity, they're a fairly sassy group of women, the ones who went to Carville. They were from Emmitsburg. They were actually sent. So there's an interesting Maryland link for those of us who live in Maryland, because Emmitsburg is right here. And they they were known as, their order was known for social justice, dealing with poverty, working in, workhouses and other things when they were, that was sort of they saw as their mission. And they were also very intelligent. They got to do science while they were there, which was fascinating. They were the pharmacists, they were dispensing medicines, they were doing research and discovery. So they also, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and times when women weren't educated, were not allowed, but encouraged and sort of just pitched up and pitched in to help with the research. So I do think, as my sister said, this was a really unique group of people, the public health service physicians, the Daughters of Charity, who were the nurses, and the patients had this incredible alliance that formed, and they were resilient and persistent about getting to Carville's cure, which was the eventual discovery of the sulfone antibiotics, which essentially are what we're still using. I mean, the medication hasn't really changed that much from the 1940s, but it was really pioneered there. And it was interesting that the sisters were not just, cooks and gardeners and caretakers, they were doing science as well, which was pretty cool. Yeah, and the patients were allowed to help with it too, which was pretty cool. So they formed this really incredible community.
Right, exactly. It was like almost like a little army. I mean, it was them against the world, because they knew nobody else cared about them. Nobody else was going to try.
Honestly, as I said, until I read your book, I didn't even know this existed. We didn't know they were there.
I've got to tell you, I was talking to the dean of the Tulane School of Public Health, right, about this book, because I'm going to be talking to him. He had no clue. He had never heard of this.
That's amazing.
Just, like 60 miles away. He had never heard of this institution.
The last question, and then we have to show the book cover again, is there anywhere to go see these photos beyond what you shared? I would say go buy the book.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yes.
Absolutely.
Or you can go to the museum. You can, when we can travel again, you can go to Carville. It is a museum. The national, the hospital, I think, has been turned into a museum. And I think all the research arm has moved to LSU and is now in Baton Rouge.
I would highly, it is a little bit off, out of the way, but I think the museum is just fascinating. And you actually can, obviously you should buy my book. That would be the best. But some of the pictures, a lot of the pictures are on, you can see online as well.
There's a great photo insert, and it really illustrates the heroes and the real people there, and I think makes us all think a lot about what we're going through right now with this pandemic. We need some of this to guide us, I think.
Right, and that's the other thing. When people ask what are the parallels for today, what I saw with Carville was how the decisions that were made decades ago still had these repercussions today with my father-in-law, who, quite frankly, it kind of ruined his life because he had to keep this secret. And I came across numerous families who were still bearing the scars of this. And so, it's, when these decisions are made about how to deal with disease and illness, it's not just the patients that have it's everybody around them, and people have to think about those repercussions.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. And I also read the book, and I can vouch for it. It's just such an interesting story, and there's just some wonderful, very memorable characters, and it's very inspirational how they take charge of their lives to make change among themselves and the other patients. And so we do want to thank you. And again, I want to thank Ellen McDonald for introducing us to you. And our tradition is to, people can leave, but we always kind of hang out for a couple more minutes. I know some people may have other follow-up questions, and I'm sure some people want to quote unquote meet you, Pam. So if we could
sign the book.
So those of you who want to hang out for a few more minutes and ask questions, you are welcome to do so. Thanks so much for joining us.
That's right.
And you can unmute yourselves, of course.
So far, everybody's saying, thank you, very interesting presentation. So.
Who knew leprosy could be so interesting, right?
I know.
I like to talk about it being a fun book about leprosy.
Well, it's a hopeful one.
It is a hopeful one.
And that's the Cynthia Riaposa and I think somebody else up above said, were the patients allowed to work?
Yeah, so where they worked was at Carville. So they were allowed, if they wanted to get government jobs at the facility. And so a lot of them worked, some of them worked in the cafeteria, but a lot of them worked in the lab. Or helping to care for some of the other patients. So I think as Anne mentioned, some of them, they were very involved in their own care. Some of them helped do the research, some of the medical research, and it was a way that they could get some money, some of them to send home. Some of these people were breadwinners, like my father-in-law's father. He was the breadwinner. When he left, the family lost their business. They lost all their money.
Wow.
And this was a lot. So a lot of them, if they could get some extra money to send home, that was helpful. And also the public health service thought, well, it's also people need to be occupied. They need to feel like they have some worth. So they were definitely allowed to work, but only in Carville.
Only income. So they were not allowed. This is Shanta Bryant's Agayan's earlier question, following up. Were they bound to their living quarters or were they ever allowed to venture into town at any time?
Actually, we didn't talk about this all. Later on, they were initially up until like 1950s. No, but they used to sneak out. And there was something called the hole in the fence, which was sort of way in one corner, and it's still actually there today, that patients it wasn't really a hole in the fence, it was underneath, you kind of pulled it up, and they would crawl out, and people would go out. There was a bar about a mile away. I think it was called the Red Rooster. And patients would go down there and they would drink. Sometimes they would go out dancing. Sometimes patients escaped to go get married and then would come back. Sometimes they escaped for good. But a lot of times, as I say, the world outside wasn't so great.
Right.
With leprosy. So a lot of times they just went, there were a lot of young people. They wanted to go have fun. So they would escape and then they would come back. And if you were caught, there was actually a jail in Carville,
Yes.
which was really bizarre that you would have a jail inside of
a jail.
Yeah, right.
We're talking about people who are sick. I mean, but they were actually put in the Carville jail, and you would, serve 30 days there for your first escape, 60 days for your second. And John Early, who we mentioned earlier, he escaped all the time. He ended up spending 6 months in the Carville jail. That's when he wrote his memoir.
Wow. This is a movie with John Early. Who should play John Early?
I couldn't decide whether it's a John Early movie or Stanley Stein movie. I think maybe Stanley Stein might be a better movie.
Well, they're both great characters and they were real people. So
yes, exactly.
I know. You have to show one picture of the nuns, though, or not the Sisters of Charity. Have you shown their hats?
No, I didn't show.
Oh my God!
Let me just get theirs. They were great. So let me.
That's
I think it's well.
Oh, that's great.
Perfect. Okay, so this is I mentioned Sister Hillary, who was the photographer. She was not only the photographer, she was also the pharmacist. And she also ran the lab eventually. She did tons and tons of research that ultimately actually led to the cure, wrote medical papers. But as you can see, they were the Daughters of Charity, the ones with these huge
the cornets.
And they used to, when I was up in Emmitsburg working in the archive, I was talking to one of the former sisters, one of the sisters there, who they don't wear the habits anymore, and she was telling me one that those things were unbelievably uncomfortable. They also had to be heavily starched so that they would stay up. And she said, "I have no idea how these sisters down in Louisiana in the summertime kept those things starched." And they also wore this heavy woolen habit.
Oh.
And can you imagine, trying to work in this, really remote area with the patients without much support at all, wearing those habits. And I just love that. And this is the sisters. This is one of the sisters. They're waving goodbye. This is when some patients actually got better. It was, they don't know if they weren't actually cured early on, but it was like the disease went into remission. And so some of them left, and they had a ceremony for them that was kind of the flip side of, in medieval times, people who had leprosy, they would have almost like a funeral for them when they were taken out of the city and isolated. It was like they were dead, and they would have a funeral. So this was the opposite of them. When they left Carville, they would give them what they call like a rebirth ceremony. And so this is the sisters waving goodbye.
That's so cool.
It's an amazing place, I got to tell you.
It sort of reminds me a little bit of what hospitals do now for COVID patients.
Yes,
They
I
have
hadn't thought of that. That's
When
your
they
yes.
clap,
Discharge
when they-
ceremonies.
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
pretty amazing.
We ring them out. Yeah.
I have a
Great.
quick question. You had mentioned in passing that you don't use the term leper anymore. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Oh, yeah, good. Yeah, and that was partly Stanley Stein. They realized, so actually the disease that's called leprosy in the Bible, it's probably was not leprosy, because the symptoms are not anything related to the disease that we call leprosy today, although the disease, the official name is now Hansen's disease, which is named after the Norwegian doctor who discovered the bacteria that caused it. But that was a huge campaign by the patients at Carville to get people to stop using the word leper, leprosy, because there was so much stigma attached to that word. And they felt like if we were called, people who had Hansen's disease, they would not have to suffer so much from the stigma. I mean, that they suffered almost more from the word itself than from the germ. And so I would never use
And
it.
that is actually, that's actually something we do now in medicine. Generally speaking, we try not to name you. You have a condition. You are not defined by your condition. And so this came out of Carville and came out of the Americans for Disability movement, where you're not. I mean, I don't want to say that because I'll get in trouble. You're not your disease,
Right.
But there were all kinds of. You're not a consumptive. You have tuberculosis. You're not a leper. You have leprosy or Hansen's disease, and there are many worse pejorative ones that I can't even say on this because I'd be afraid of what would happen. Words that we used to use to define patients, particularly patients with disability. So we don't do that anymore. We're trying to educate ourselves to not do that. And it's hard. It's a cultural change, even for physicians and people.
Right. And we still use,
It's a label.
We
Right?
still
It's a
use the
pejorative
word
label.
leper. We still use, he's treated like a leper.
Right.
It's still seen as somebody, you look in the dictionary, the first definition is pariah or outcast.
Yes. Yeah. Outcast. Right. It's become a term. Right. Exactly. That's related to. It's been it's now a cultural term more than it is a medical term.
Right.
As Mildred says here, healthcare is moving to putting the person first, as opposed to, a person with diabetes, not a diabetic.
Right, diabetic, correct. So we're trying to shed those, as if you are defined entirely just by your disease or your condition. You are a person with a condition. You are a person, first. And it's a big shift. And I'm having to learn it because I wasn't trained that way.
Right,
I learned all those other terms.
Mhm.
So I have to watch myself.
I do use leprosy, even though the patients at the
Mhm.
time, Stanley Stein, they didn't want leper or leprosy, anything.
Right.
But I use it.
It is leprosy. I mean, that's an appropriate
because
term.
that's
right.
how it's known around the world.
Right. And the bacterium is Mycobacterium leprae. I mean, that is what it is. But it is an interesting change in the way we're trying to not label you with your disease as if that's the sole defining aspect of your personhood.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't see more
Thank you.
questions coming in.
Thanks again, Pam, and thank you so much, Carolyn and Anne, for leading us through this conversation. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was
Great.
fascinating.
I hope people read the book. And
Yes.
Thank you again, Pam, for a great evening.
yeah,
Thank
thanks a lot.
you. Yes.
Great. Bye. Thank you.
Good night,
Thanks for
everyone.
coming, Paul.
Take care. And there might be an audiobook. Is there an audiobook?
There is
There
an
is, yeah.
There is an
Mhm.
audio,
Okay, so audio, ebook,
Kindle,
physical
yeah,
book, Kindle.
the whole thing. And go to the museum. The museum's
Yeah.
great. It's closed right now because of COVID, but
Of course, yeah.
Congratulations, Pam. Thank you for this work.
Yeah.
thanks a
Great.
lot, guys.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.